Okay, everyone, I'm glad you're able to join us today for our continuing program around webinar education related to the voice industry. And we've had some interesting sessions so far. A couple of weeks ago, we had Roger Kibbe from Samsung and Viv Labs introduce Bixby. Just a couple of weeks ago, we also had Ben Fisher with Ava and I. We're talking about the Voice Assistant SEO report. You can check those out at voicebot.ai/webinars. The recordings are available. Today we have another event for you, and this is around another piece of research that we conducted with voices.com. And the webinar is really about that marketer's view and their experience with voice assistants as a channel. We've done a lot of work as VoiceBot in terms of research on the consumer side related to the adoption of smart speakers, of voice assistants on smartphones and other surfaces. And we've looked also at some data around how SEO is working and how voice commerce is proceeding. But what we really wanted to do and what we wanted to collaborate with Voices on was looking at marketers, what their level of adoption has been thus far. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, the first thing I will point out is that all of the data we're presenting today is available in a research report that we put out a week ago Friday, so just recently. So this is all data collected in June of 2019. And you can find that at voicebot.ai/research, voicebot.ai/research. So you can see the full report. You know, we're talking 30 pages of analysis, 20 charts. It'll go into more depth than we can get to today. We're going to cover a lot of it in our discussion, but I just wanted to know that's a resource and you'll be able to follow along if you'd like. The next thing I'd like to point out is that we do have other webinars coming up. So the next one will actually be next week on Tuesday. We have Roger Kibbe from Samsung and Viv Labs again. He's going to be talking about the Bixby marketplace and capsules. So if that's of interest to you, he's going to go deeper than the previous webinar he did last month. This is going to go much deeper into how you work with capsules, how you get positioned in the marketplace. And so for anyone who's really looking at this either from a developer's perspective or a marketer perspective, it should be really useful information from someone who is dealing with this on a day-to-day basis and has sort of the inside track. It's a good perspective for you to get firsthand from that team. So that's Tuesday, August 6th. Go to voicebot.ai/webinars to register for that. And then you can also see our previous webinars as well when you get there. Before we get too much further, just for those of you who are familiar with Zoom, this won't be news to you, but there is a Q&A feature. There's also a chat feature which you can use, but the Q&A feature is largely what we're going to use to run the Q&A at the end. And so as we go through, the guests and I will be talking about the report, and we will, at the end, we're going to try to answer as many questions as possible. So get them into that Q&A feature so that we can start to answer them, but also we'll try to answer as many as possible afterwards if we don't get to them during the session. And there's already been a question, will this be available afterwards? What we're doing with each of these webinars is we are recording them, and we were making them available on voicebot.ai/webinars, so you'll be able to see a recording fairly soon after we complete this today. Okay, so that's enough on the background. I want to talk about today's speakers. So I'm your host, Brett Kinsella, founder and editor of voicebot.ai. I also have with me Ava Muchler, my colleague at voicebot.ai and co-founder. Ava, say hello.
Hello, thank you for joining us today.
And David Cicerelli from voices.com.
Hey, Brett. Hey, Ava, good to be here.
All right, great. So David, why don't you tell everybody a little bit about voices.com and why you got involved in this project?
Sure. So my background is an audio engineer. I opened up a small recording studio that serviced people that were looking for voiceover talent. My wife actually was a former actress and voice talent, and we began working together. That soon we recognized, hey, if we built a website, and I'm going back about a decade now, if we built a website, maybe we could generate some more business. And that actually attracted other freelance voice actors from all around the world. Of whom now there's 300,000 voice actors, both aspiring voice actors getting into the business, professionals, celebrities. And we run a marketplace that connects those actors with job opportunities. So a business client like marketers, ad agency executives, video producers, even voice app developers that are looking to hire a voice actor can use voices.com as a freelance economy type gig marketplace by posting a job and finding the right person for their needs. And so as we've witnessed, this evolution in voice technology, that's kind of, I would say, been on this evolution from, first kind of going from analog to digital and home studios being accessible, and then mobile technology and, the resurgence of audiobooks and podcasts and apps for games and apps on phones. That next iteration is, most commonly associated with this kind of voice first hashtag and movement, dare I say, that people kind of on a day-to-day basis recognize this as, oh, right, I get it. I understand there's smart speakers, or I maybe have a voice assistant in my car. And so we've been seeing these type of projects be posted on voices.com and wanted to understand, is this the next big thing? Are marketers ready? And so that's why we reached out to you, Brett, just to, reach out in turn to survey a lot of our customers, people in your network as well too, and unpack this. And what is their perspective? What's their view? Have they deployed voice apps yet? If not, why not? When do they think to do so? And so that was really the motive, is just better understand marketers' perspective on this whole space.
Great. Okay, super. So we collaborated, we went out into the field, we talked to more than 300 marketers in North America, and here is what they said. So the first thing is that marketers really have a positive view of voice assistants as a marketing channel. So that's the first thing we wanted to point out in terms of our findings. It looks like somewhere around 63% of marketers view voice assistants as a very important marketing channel going forward. And probably more important, if you just look at it, is that only 11.5% think it's not going to be that important at all. And so for the most part, there's a group of people, around a third, who say they're not really sure, it's moderately or not sure. And then there's 11% who definitely say it's not going to be important. And mostly people do think it's going to be important. So I think that's an important finding of what we think about. And the next thing I wanted to point out, and then we'll get input from David and Ava on this, is that the marketer view of which voice assistant has the most potential today. And what we saw was a really significant lead for Amazon Alexa, which came in at 61%, Google Assistant being second at 24%, followed by Apple Siri. So the first thing I wanted to just point out in terms of, or put out as a question, is to you, David, when you see this optimism around marketers for this new channel, and you also see that they believe that Amazon Alexa is probably the most promising today, what was your initial reaction to that?
Well, marketers are always going to go where the people are. And, Amazon did a great job on seeding the market with, Echoes and Echo Dot's #1 selling product on Amazon, both for Black Friday and Cyber Monday last year. I would imagine it's going to be the same thing again this year. Saw some early reports on that there was, healthy, again, uptick of on kind of, Amazon's, summer sales and so forth. So I think there's a lot of interest. And, even, a little bit anecdotally, with new staff that join Voices or we're at conferences, I often ask, people aren't just buying one of these devices. They're buying, I think the average is like 1.7 is kind of the latest data that I've seen. So there's a lot of devices. They're being adopted in the home and in the office as well too. And so marketers are thinking, hey, this is not only a new channel, it's a way to reach people in arguably their safest, most comfortable environment that we didn't have access to before. And so, Alexa gets the headlines for sure. They've tons of ads, even through traditional television kind of broadcast ads, including, I believe, on the Super Bowl this year, and still see national campaigns. And Google Assistant is visible as well. So and I think this is an important distinction, Brett. This is marketers' view of which assistant has the most potential today, as it currently stands. So Amazon Grabs probably the most headlines, and in which case it makes sense that marketers are gravitating to viewing Alexa as having the most potential today.
And I also think it's fair to say this is North American marketers, right? So there's Canadian marketers in there as well, but they're a smaller percentage of the cohort. And in Canada, actually, Google Assistant has larger market, or Google Home has larger smart speaker market share, and Google Assistant certainly larger use. Mm-hmm. You know, I think if we went to Australia, for example, if we went to some countries in Europe, we might see a different layout of this in terms of what they thought was most important. The other thing too is, and Ava, you might want to weigh in on this, is we also asked the question about future potential. So if you look at this chart now, and I'll describe it for people who are just listening to this later from a podcast format, but we have this idea that Amazon Alexa is viewed as has the most potential by 61% today, 24% for Google Assistant, Apple Siri 13%, and Bixby and Cortana are both under 1%. When they talk about the question of future potential, and we had force ranking, we also had this singular choice that people say, what do they think is most important? Amazon Alexa only falls to about 58% or 57.6%. So it drops about 3% from, in terms of what people see of it today versus the future. Interestingly, Google Assistant moves up 3% and narrows that gap a little bit, but it's still a 30-point difference. Siri comes in 11.3% long-term, Bixby jumps up to almost 2.5%, and Cortana just under 2%. So it looks like Amazon falls just a little bit, Apple falls a little bit, everything else rises, but the difference is really still significant. What did you make of this, Ava?
I think that marketers might view Amazon Alexa as more with more potential, just because they've done a great job of marketing Alexa as like the primary voice assistant. And I also think a lot of people, including marketers, associate Amazon with retail, which for brands means revenue. It also, I think, has the strongest development tools, which we've seen again. We did a survey, and voice developers said that Amazon had the most robust tool set. I think they create a lot of blueprints, and it making it easier for anyone to create a skill, including brands. I'm also not surprised that marketers are excited about the potential to talk to consumers directly. We talked about this last week at Voice, Brett, at our workshop, but the Westworld Alexa skill enabled a very passive TV viewing experience. It enabled that brand and HBO to directly interact and engage with consumers, which is something that most people don't get via a television watching experience.
Yeah, I think those are all fair comments. I was surprised by this. I really thought, it didn't actually surprise me that more marketers thought Alexa would be maybe had a little more potential today. They've got broader distribution. They have a little bit of a lead. They've got some cultural zeitgeist going on right now. I was surprised that more marketers didn't see Google as, maybe the more important player long-term. David, any thoughts on that?
Building a platform, which really all of these are platforms, it needs two different participants. You have on one side the producers of, be it the content or the voice applications, and the other side are the consumers, people who are, using those apps. Amazon is by far and away the most advanced, and typically in platform type businesses, where you're connecting buyer and seller or user, producer or consumer, the big just get bigger. And when you have that first mover advantage, whether you're kind of number one or number two, it is really difficult for other platforms that might offer something similar to play catch up. You have to build out the developer ecosystem. You have to, embed your technology into other environments. I think, Amazon executed so well on developer tools and building out evangelists and communities of people that it's making it easier to deploy, in which case they're having a lot more success with skills and flash briefings than, there's just not even an analogy on Apple Siri at present. So I also, the last comment I'll make on this with respect to Siri is, it seems like, people are optimistic in the near term, maybe declining by a few percentage points. If Apple doesn't do something significant in, the next 12, 18, 24 months, it looks like people are getting maybe discouraged that, if it's not now, it may be never, that gap is going to be so huge. So I think that somewhat explains a little bit of the drop that marketers view, that Apple's got to get their act together if they're going to be serious about Siri. And if so, let's see some action in the next 12, 18, 24 months.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Siri OS, here we come, 2020, or maybe not. I guess we'll see. Those are all important. And I think it is fair to say that I ran a story on this in VoiceBot yesterday, and we solicited comments from some of the people who are leaders in the industry, and Pat Higby from Zap Media made a good point. It doesn't really matter who's first and second if everyone's going to support the first two.
Right.
What really matters then is are you in the first two or are you not? And we see some of that. And so if we look at some of the additional data here, if we look at a forced ranking, sort of on a 5-point scale, which voice assistants have the most long-term potential, Google Assistant and Siri they start to compress that difference with Amazon Alexa. You can start to see, obviously there's a big gap, 30-point gap, but it's like just a small percentage when you look at who has the most long-term potential. And for those people who might be listening to this later on, Amazon was ranked at 4.4, Google Assistant 3.8, and Apple Siri about 3.5, with Bixby and Cortana under 2 in terms of, on a 5-point scale, in terms of long-term potential. But as we move forward and we look at what people are actually doing over the next year, so that's a great thing to ask marketers, not just what are you doing today, but what do you plan to do the next year? Beyond the next year, most of them don't know. And we see a further compression where in terms of the amount of time they're going to spend, actually Amazon Alexa falls to about under 3.6, Google Assistant's 3.3, Apple Siri 3, and then Bixby and Cortana around 2.5. And so you see that compression. And what that suggests to me is maybe people have already made some bets on Alexa and Google Assistant, and they're focused on the other platforms. But in general, a lot of marketers plan to spend some time and effort on most of these platforms over the next year, just so they're ready in case one of them breaks out. Any thoughts on that, Ava?
That surprises me only because Apple Siri on the HomePod doesn't have that many capabilities for developers to make apps today. But I guess if you're viewing it from a smartphone app experience, as in putting voice into your apps, it makes sense because of the iPhone's install base.
Yeah, and Siri shortcuts, which is an effort in order to get Siri accessibility, or at least voice navigation to your app. Any thoughts on this one, David?
Well, when we ask, marketers' focus over the next year, their focus could just be digging deeper on research. It's not, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think we got to the point with, an intent to deploy an app on a particular platform in the next year. I think it's a totally valid observation that if you've already invested and deployed your skill on Alexa, okay, well now you're moving on to the next 2 and 3 players within the space, and maybe that initial focus is let's research more, let's get our corporate innovation lab spun up to shift projects a bit. But the way I look at this is any market is if not a winner take all, it's a winner take most, and that winner is like number 1, 2, and 3. Nobody remembers who comes in fourth at the Olympics, and usually it's the gold and silver medal that most people are going to remember. Who was in the finals? And so I think it's getting more compressed. I really do believe over time that unless there's an efficient way that people can deploy apps across the top platforms, where the code base, the functionality is, and the feature set is on parity, which consumers are, I mean, that is a big challenge. Consumers are going to expect that they can shift between these, as you refer to them, these different services. And theoretically, even having a very similar experience, maybe if I'm switching between Assistant, Google Assistant, or in my home, and maybe Alexa in my car, there's going to be that expectation. So marketers are going to drive that. They're going to, consumers will drive it, marketers will drive it, and I'm looking forward to these platforms even further, raising their game in the development tool set that they're offering.
Yeah, well said. Okay, so another thing we found, so moving on, is we looked at surfaces. So when we asked marketers about where was it important for them to have a voice presence, they did not say smart speakers number one. In fact, they said smartphones number one. And so what we see here is that in terms of extremely important, which surface do they need to have a voice presence on? Smartphones came in at 63%, automobiles came in at 43.5%, and smart speakers around 41%, with smart TVs, watches, and wearables and home appliances somewhere below 30%. So if we look at that, and then if we just look at the expansion of that to significantly important, where you get up to, around 90% on the smartphones, where you're closer to 75% on automobiles and smart speakers. Smartphones stand out for marketers as a place they want to have a presence, not just for mobile apps, but for some sort of interactive voice experience. What are your thoughts on that, David?
I think what we're seeing here are marketers they already have an iOS or an Android application. They understand the install base. It's already there. They've already had success with smartphones. So perhaps what we're seeing is leveraging and building off that existing success using a platform or a surface, if you will, that they're already familiar with is really what the intent is here. So I think that's one thing that's there. And marketers, not only is the install base, they're going to go where people are, they're also know that they need to justify their investments. And there's a lot more analytics already built out within the smartphone experience for marketers, particularly. And maybe it's kind of one voice command away from being into commerce or some other call to action, where you're, marrying the auditory and visual elements, yet still in a personalized experience that's handheld. I think these are all pluses that lend to why smartphones are most optimistic. Why marketers are most optimistic about smartphones.
What do you think, Ava? Smartphones, automobiles, smart speakers?
I was actually surprised that more marketers don't see the potential in smart TVs, because it's basically like a giant multimodal screen. And as we saw at CES, a lot of the manufacturers are betting big on having voice in your TV and getting rid of the remote entirely. And this can lend itself to other apps, and we're seeing this today.
Well, that's interesting. So the number is, I think, about 55% saw smart TVs as extremely or significantly important. And I was surprised by that. I think those are much further away from being robust experiences. I thought they would focus much more on sort of the big three, and the big three are obviously important to them. But it seems to me, once again, as you mentioned, David, marketers kind of feel like they need to be everywhere, and that might be across as many assistants as possible, but also as many surfaces as possible. Even 30% think they should be on home appliances, right? So obviously a pretty big one. But the other thing that struck me that was interesting was that basically automobiles and smart speakers are in a dead heat. And we hear a lot of focus of the attention around the smart speakers, because that's what sort of kicked off this era of voice interaction. And it does introduce all these new use cases in the home. And as you said, David, it's the first time that we had access to consumers directly for this interaction in the home, in this sort of passive environment that doesn't require sort of them actively engaging with a visual device and those types of things. And so that's interesting. But I thought automobiles was really interesting too, because a lot of people don't recognize, but I believe a lot of marketers do, that there's this captive audience while driving that are hard to reach. You can reach them through radio ads today and through billboards. It's pretty much it. And neither of those are interactive. And so this is really the first interactive medium where you might be able to engage with consumers while they're driving, while they're on the go.
And Brett, while marketers that we surveyed may or may not be aware of this fact, we heard from the chief evangelist at Amazon now again for the second conference in a row, validating this this number of 1 million pre-orders of the Alexa Auto. And so, you know, Amazon clearly recognizes that this is an environment that is likewise ripe for disruption. And again, marketers are familiar with it. They understand the space. You know, the average kind of car commute, I've heard somewhere between, you know, 45 to 60 minutes per day. And even if you're in urban areas, I mean, the distance might not be far, but you're still stuck in a car. And so what do you do? And I think, you know, the more that that brands out there can ask themselves, where are my customers and where are my potential customers? How can I communicate with them in a more, you know, human and direct and intimate way? Arguably, there's nothing more human than the voice. This just presents an opportunity. So, to me, this aspect of the automobiles is probably the most potential in the future, which is why I view it as an important part of the marketing mix for hopefully 2020 and beyond.
Yeah, fair enough. There's a lot of time spent in the car. In fact, Nico Fiore of Drive Time FM has told me that it's the same amount of time spent playing mobile games is spent commuting. So if you think about that, you're like, I don't know if people think that's large or not, but it's a lot in both cases. Just put that in perspective, and the fact that, you know, everyone's trying to reach people while they're gaming. This is an opportunity. While they're gaming, and frankly, while they're driving, but they potentially can take in these other messages. Okay, so. So one of the things too that we found out was, in terms of voice app launches, that many marketers are still on the sidelines. And I think it's pretty easy to look at our number and say, okay, of the marketers in our survey, 49% had no plans to launch a voice app and had not launched a voice app yet. Now there's another 17% who aren't sure, but let's just look at that 50%. It's a lot of people that haven't, and I'll move on to the next point, which I think is also interesting. Is the flip side of that is voice app adoption has actually grown kind of quickly. So the question is, when did voice engagement for brands really start? Well, the Echo came out in 2014, but you couldn't actually build anything on it until 2015. It was really 2016 where their evangelism got out there. 2016 was also when Google Assistant came out, so you had two alternatives. It was sort of a validated space. So I usually count from there. Is really, that's when people beyond the hobbyists and provide the very early innovators started to look at this seriously. And so what that means is, through the end of last year, 2 years time essentially, about 24%, about a quarter of marketers had put something into market. By the end of this year, it'll be about 30%. And by the end of next year, about 20 should be 34%, based on what people say now. So I can look at that and I can say, geez, you know, at 2020, it'll be 4 years since sort of the main entrance of these new solutions, and over a third of marketers will have something in market. And interestingly enough, we also had this situation where by the end of this year, we'll probably have a little over a third of consumers with smart speakers. We're going to have about 2/3 who are using voice assistants in smartphones, but it's probably going to be something like half of those who are using the actual voice apps as opposed to just the core assistant capabilities. So, you know, David, what's your take on this in terms of the rate of adoption? Is that the important thing out of this story, or is the important part of the story that half of marketers have yet to take action and don't have any plans yet?
Well, initially, it looks like there's a disconnect between marketers viewing voice as a very important channel, but then a third of people have done anything about it and 2/3 haven't. And so when there's no plans, you know, marketers can say, you know what, I'm a brand manager, this is important to me, yet if there aren't the case studies, there aren't the points from other organizations that have been successful in that are, you know, easily referenceable, they may have a hard time getting budget. And so I think that when we're asking kind of midway through a year, hey, do you have any plans to launch a voice app? They're saying no plans as of now because it's not, you know, most companies haven't started a 2020 budget cycle, or they're just at the outset of it now. And so I think that as much as there's optimism, that needs to convert from marketers being excited into it driving either product strategy or maybe larger corporate strategy, or they need to develop the plans themselves as a key component in how they're going to reach their customers. So I actually look at this and go, you know what, for, you know, 4 years to get a third of the market, you know, adopting, I think that's pretty phenomenal. To be honest with you, it's the question is, how do we capture the rest and provide the necessary, you know, tools and, if you will, encouragement to those brand managers that currently have no plans? What is it that they might need in order to justify the investment?
Yeah, sure. So Ava, you just got back from Voice 19 in Newark, New Jersey. Actually, David and I were all there. There were a number of brands there. Most of the brands who were there were presenting on stage, things they were doing. Do these numbers surprise you? Does it seem about right? How do you reinterpret them?
I think it's about right. From what I noticed at Voice, it was a lot of more of the content brands that were there, or people that can utilize like a hands-free experience specifically, such as cooking or and general other content creators. I'm actually surprised the numbers is high, but I'm also thinking that some of these agencies, one of their 10 brands might have created an app, so it could actually be lower in as far as total number of clients. So I think we should be a little cautious about the number of 24%.
Okay. Yeah. And I think, you know, if we lined it up, if we look at what we just did with the voice assistant SEO report, we found that closer to 30% of brands of the top 200 top brands, not the top 200 brands, but 200 top brands across 20 different categories had some sort of voice app presence. That makes sense to me, given that the larger organizations would be more likely to have already made a foray into this space. And that we also in our survey captured some smaller organizations who are not going to be in sort of that top 100. They might be sort of more closer to 1,000 or 1,500 and maybe less likely. So I think this seems about right to me, that maybe it's 20%, maybe it's 24% today. It's probably not 30% broadly, but the larger you are, the more likely you have been to do something. I think that's fair. The other thing I'd say is that there are a lot of brands that are making forays, but it seems like a lot of the enthusiasm is from those content creators because they're definitely getting real traction. The other thing we saw is that for the agencies that we interviewed, brand marketer sentiment has been really high around voice assistants when they discuss that with their clients, who are the brand marketers. But there's a significant portion that haven't done that, you know, or that they're interested, but they're not engaged yet, right? Or they're not interested right now. And so David, you talked about the disconnect earlier and those types of things. But for the most part, there's a positive sentiment. We saw that the first data point we discussed today. We see it here. And then we see people coming along. But I think as you'd said previously, David, you know, the brands go where the consumers are, but they generally go after the consumers get there.
There's always going to be a lag for sure. You know, social media is a great example of that. You know, there is a time where the only people, and I'm going back here, the only people on Twitter were people at South by Southwest, and the only people on Google Plus were Google employees. And, you know, different platforms and services are going to come and go, but it's usually a homegrown phenomenon first, very organic. And then once there's this, you know, quote unquote critical mass, whatever that looks like, that it makes sense that people are dedicating sufficient kind of time and resources into first understanding the technology and the opportunity at hand. And then, and then beyond that, deciding, developing a strategy of actually how to execute on it. So I think for the most part, that is a common pattern that, people tend to lead the way. There's the innovators are going to certainly lead the way, those early adopters, and of consumers. Marketers are pretty quick to catch on, and they're trailing just a little bit. But I think that's a common pattern.
Yeah, great. All right, we're going to hit a couple things really quickly, and then so that we can wrap up couple additional discussion points, and then we're going to get to the Q&A. So first of all, from a voice app marketing standpoint, almost 60% have launched on Amazon Alexa, about a third on Google Assistant, and then the other platforms are well behind there. They also have been most likely to launch a question and answer type voice app. And so something that answers some sort of questions, that's what they selected. Now, you'll look at this in terms of that's about 50% of the marketers that we talk to. They could select multiple of these because some things could answer questions, or they could also provide a service or a feature associated with their product. So these numbers will add up to more than 100%, but 41% have focused around their product to augment that product or provide an additional feature. 35% are distributing content. 21% are helping consumers choose a product, and only 12% offer a call to action. So when we think about this, then this just goes to something I was talking to a lot of people about last week in New Jersey, which was a lot of people are looking at voice apps as if they're an island, if they're sort of this isolated project, and they're not tying it together with their other digital properties, with other digital campaigns. It's not part of the omni-channel mix by and large yet. Ava, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's important because the voice technology isn't quite there yet to become the sole interactive experience that you want to have with a consumer, obviously. But there are ways that it can aid or help your other marketing channels, or bring new consumers in, or remind consumers about your brand. And I think a call to action is important, whether it's just a card from Alexa, or sending an email, or getting the contact information. I think it could help brands grow other channels as well.
Yeah, fundamentally, audio content is to educate, inform, or entertain. And when I look at these, you're educating a consumer by answering the questions. You might be informing them by helping them choose a product, or maybe there's an entertainment element depending on the type of voice app that's launched, whether it's, again, a storyline, something kind of more, or there's, music and sound effects, and it's maybe a game, or, almost like an audiobook or story, auditory kind of drama, if you will. So I look at these and I feel like that's, these type of voice apps certainly fit that educate, inform, or entertain mold.
Yeah, I think that's probably where we are right now. And if we think about what marketers wanted to learn, sort of our next finding here is that what their objectives were is they wanted to learn. 57% said their voice app objective was to get to know the technology and learn. And that was followed by controlling their brand messaging on the voice assistant. They wanted a chance to have their own voice being heard, so to speak. And then another 31% saying they would do something novel, while about 28% were really focused on sort of consumer education. So if we think about those types of things, I think what we're seeing in the market, it doesn't surprise me that a lot of these apps are not that sophisticated, because most people are going out there to learn as opposed to really drive their business forward.
Yeah, the evolution here is the old crawl, walk, run. And maybe we're just learning to, we've gotten past the crawl. We're learning to walk a little bit with the technology, or at least the marketers are. That's why it's their objective. Before they're really running and augmenting capabilities to their existing product, or answering sophisticated questions that might be coming into a contact center. I think it's a good degree of self-awareness here, that they need to learn the technology and what the opportunity is at hand. So I actually think this is very reaffirming that those that we reached out to, have a degree of self-awareness to dive in and spend the time needed to actually learn what the opportunity is at hand.
Yeah, and we'll continue with you, David. So one of the other findings we had was just thinking about the type of content and how that content is portrayed to the user. And what we found was 74% use the default voice assistant, either from Google Assistant or Alexa. 12% used some other synthetic voice, like Amazon Polly would be a good example of that. And 15% use something that you're pretty familiar with, which is voice actors. So when you saw this, did that surprise you? Did you think more people were using voice actors? Do you think it was fewer?
Well, I didn't necessarily think it was more, given my use with our own Alexas at home. You don't hear as many voice actors. Most people, of course, are, for a variety of reasons, using the default voice. But I do think this is also reflective of the type of voice apps that are being produced. And so, the previous chart was, identifying, hey, question, answer, maybe tapping into a database of where the possibilities of what the person, is, asking, the answers could be, so varied that it would be very difficult to have a voice actor head into the studio and record infinite possibilities. And so to me, it makes sense that, as a developer or a marketer is initially choosing the default voice, perhaps because of cost or availability, thoughts around the content's going to be changing all the time, so they need to maintain it. So that, I think, that makes sense to me. There are a time and a place where, likewise, it makes sense that you would want to work with a voice actor. Maybe you have a character that's part of your brand, and that character has a whole persona, and you want to bring that persona to life. It maybe was a visual character before, a mascot, if you will, and you're suddenly realizing that you need to breathe life into that character. That's where it might make sense to work with a voice actor. And I think we have on this, those that, only half are considering, half aren't. Because the other half, the content changes, it's too dynamic, stock ticker quotes, flight gate changes, news headlines that are read out almost in near real time. That's the type of content that's very short, has a short shelf life as well too, in which case it would be difficult to work with a voice actor. The flip side would be if it's story driven or character driven. That is where I think a voice actor could add a lot of value in terms of driving engagement of the application itself.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there are, first of all, I think it's fair to say of all voice apps, like the percentage that have voice actors is very, very small. But like now we see among marketers or brands that are putting things out there, 15% have used it. And I think that number is only going to grow. I would say that you're absolutely right. There's a lot of the things people have done today, these Q&A things, you don't get that much additional benefit out of having a voice actor. Maybe it's a small amount. The story-driven things obviously are big. But the other thing that I've seen a few people do, even with these things that are more interactive and but maybe short transactional things, is it makes it a better experience. Entertainment Weekly, they invested in a voice actor or presenter to read their copy, that they update daily in terms of their news. It makes a big difference. So I expect to see a lot more of this, but you're absolutely right. That whole framework you laid out at Voice 19 around the dynamism of the content is like a big factor. And I think it's just, if you just come back to it, if you're just trying to learn, you want to get something out there quickly, it's easier to use the stock synthetic voice that they already offer you. And so I think it's a reflection also of the objectives of a lot of these marketers. Let's get it out there. In fact, I worked with a brand organization that went out first with the synthetic voice, and about 6 months later actually replaced everything with a voice actor, with the exception of just a couple things that from a dynamic standpoint made sense.
And Brett, this is a common development process. You start with your rapid prototype, your low fidelity prototype. In this case, it's the synthetic voice that's stock out of the box. And then you escalate to like you're experimenting maybe with some different synthetic voices, maybe it's poly voice. And then you go to the high fidelity experience, which is all the emotion that a voice actor brings to that experience. So I think lo-fi to hi-fi is kind of what we're talking about here,
Right.
between synthetic and voice actor.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Okay, so we're just going to close on just very briefly, sort of rapid fire comment, because we want to get to questions. Ava, what we did find was that marketers are pretty bullish on voice for product discovery and for sales. This surprise you? I mean, I'll just tell you right now, they're more optimistic than I thought they would be. But what was your take on this?
I agree, because it's just, I mean, as we know, it's difficult even on Alexa to order a new product unless you know exactly what you're looking for or if you've already ordered it. But someone brought up a good point at Voice, was that it's important to do it now so that you get into the cart as, like, for instance, if someone asks like, Alexa, order me chocolate, that you're the chocolate in their cart or in their order history. So, and how you do that is by getting into Alexa deals. So I think it's important for people to do it now just to get a leg up on the competitions. And this also applies to smaller brands who might not have the marketing to get into like Amazon's Choice, for instance.
Yeah, I think it's fair. I would just say that, like, based on the other research we've done, I see this as a necessity. It doesn't matter if they're optimistic or not, that there's already voice shopping being done. People are asking about products, and we saw that in the voice search report that we just did. So you pretty much need to have a strategy around this, because whether they're making the transaction or not, the pre-purchase cycle is already happening on these voice assistants. So you better have a strategy to have placement. And then ultimately, a lot of these things are so easy to buy that it just works out. And we're going to see, I think, a strong rise in this coming up. Okay, Ava, why don't you throw out some of the Q&A, and we'll try to get as many questions as we can in the next 10 minutes. Oh, and I'll tell the listeners, I'll be on Twitter for a little bit after this, and I'll try to answer any additional questions that you might have. I'm at Brett Kinsella. David is at David Ciccarelli, or at Voices, at Ava_Muchler. In fact, I think I have that. Oh, there we go. We have it on the...
At Voices is an easy one to spell. Ciccarelli, not so much, but go with at Voices.
At Voices. So I'll be on as well. So we'll try to answer additional questions if we don't get to them here. So go for it, Ava.
Okay, so we have, presumably all these marketers have iOS and Android apps. Do you see customers expecting brands to have both Google and Alexa action skills within the next 5 years?
My answer is absolutely. David?
I would agree. I mean, look, if you've planned out your voice application, you've built a blueprint, I mean, look, just copy it to the next channel, especially if the audience is there. It goes back to that theme. If you're a marketer, you're going to go where all the people are.
Okay, then we have another question. What's the horizon for long term? Do you see correlation of perceived potential based on installed smart speaker share and not factoring smartphone voice assistants? Like, do you think that marketers are, I guess he's asking, do you think marketers are going for smart speaker, seeing that only smart speakers only, or is voice as a whole?
Well, I'll say two things. One is, first of all, we saw in that one chart where marketers seem to be a little bit more focused on voice on smartphones anyway, in terms of what they think is most important. So we have that data point, plus Jeff McMahon from Voicify had a comment in a story we just ran, talking about this idea that that it's not going to be lost on people for very long that there's a lot more smartphones out there than there are smart speakers, and the smartphones are with people all the time. It's not to say that smart speakers aren't important, because there's all sorts of different use cases they enable, and they, as David said, they enable that direct connection in the home. It's a different type of use case and engagement that brands have historically had access to. But the fact that the smart speakers are actually changing people's perceptions. We see this also in the data. They have more of an expectation of using voice on other surfaces while they're out and about. That is more often than not going to lead to use of voice on the smartphone. Therefore, that's where people are absolutely going to need to be. And one of the things they're going to have to think about is, do they offer the same experience? Is it the same voice app? Is it the same features that you offer while you're on the go on the phone versus in the home? These are all things that will be sorted out over time, but I suspect that the balance of focus will change significantly. David?
Yeah, I mean, marketers really ought to be thinking about voice as a channel as opposed to we are going to solve for the smart speaker in the home. Because voice is beyond, I mean, we're talking about voice apps today, but there's lots of other media that take advantage of voice. It might be a podcast, a flash briefing. It could be, basically their product demonstration videos that they're launching on YouTube. How are you speaking about your brand? What are people hearing? Is there an audio brand or some kind of sound logo or jingle that they're hearing ahead? So I think it's really about using audio as one of the main digital marketing mediums. That is really what marketers ought to be thinking about, in which case you're quickly going to go, oh, smart speakers I get, but there's, arguably 10 or 20 times as many smartphones. Holy smokes. Okay, so let's come up with a grander strategy here.
Yep. Okay, next, Ava.
Do you think for large brands, there's any advantage to starting early, or is it a better strategy to have no plans and wait till there is a better adoption and use case?
Well, I think if you've ever learned a new skill, you always wish you learned it earlier and you stuck with it longer. I certainly have that in, business and math and graphic design. For me, I wish I employed these skills, in high school and grade school and learned all that when I could, when the resources were available, and because you're learning as the industry's maturing. It gives you historical context. You're learning from others. There's this willingness to share information as industries emerge. So, I think that's why we're all here. That's why we're here on the call today, and looking at the charts and trying to unpack how other people are viewing voice, is because we want to learn together. So I would certainly advocate for starting earlier.
Yeah, and I would also say that when we talk about new technology adoption, everyone repeats the mistakes that everyone before them made. Even when they see the great examples, you don't actually save that much in the learning curve by going later. Sometimes you can avoid some really big mistakes, but for the most part, the little learnings, which all accumulate, you still have to go through firsthand. So better to get those out early when there's more tolerance for variance in your performance and all these other things, so that when things are really heated up, you're already playing your A game.
All right, next.
Yep.
What could be possible factors that influence consumer behavior in the purchase journey using voice search? Which of them requires more work for voice transactions to go up?
Say that again.
What could be possible factors that influence consumer behavior in their purchase journey using voice search? Which of them requires more work for voice transactions to go up? I would guess, what are the barriers? That's what he's asking.
Yeah, I mean, so the obvious one is that maybe you can't see things, but I don't think that's really an issue with voice now, because there's so many ways to integrate voice with visual. So that's possibly it. I think the biggest problem is selection. And so if you have something that has fewer choices, let's say even within a product line, if I just have one or two options for a product configuration, that's a lot easier to do from a voice. It's also easier to do on mobile. Let's talk about that as well. Than it is if you've got 14 different varieties where people have to sort of think through all the different value propositions of the different configurations. So I think that's really true. That's also true if you're talking about competing products. So if there's going to be one or two main choices, voice is a lot easier for you to navigate if you don't have to manage a lot of choices. And that's generally going to be true. Whereas the more choices you have, the more visual becomes more important, because there's more factors you have to consider.
Yeah, just building on that, I think if this is, a brand marketer that might be in retail or some type of, where they're offering a physical product, getting beyond three choices, I just think that the cognitive load there is just, it's overwhelming. You can't remember the first or second. So one way to overcome that, apply the rule of three. Don't exceed three choices in maybe introducing a new product, or even down select further. Offer a featured product of the day, or when designing an experience, have a single option, which is not per se exactly an option, but a single product featured where you could go a bit deeper on that one, as opposed to forcing too many choices to be made that may disengage a user. So, some experimentation is certainly to be done there, but consider the rule of three, and then, take the initiative to down select even further for your customer.
I think we're going to leave it with that today. We're coming to the end of our time. I want to respect everybody's time here. I will be on Twitter for a few minutes at Brett Kinsella if you want some additional questions. I'll try to answer a couple of these online as well. Go to voicebot.ai/research in order to download the full report. And sign up for our next webinar with Bixby. We've got a couple others coming up. I think David might be back with one. Maybe we'll do that as a podcast. But we've got some other things coming up, a lot of education, voicebot.ai/webinars. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brett Kinsella, your host of the VoiceBot webinar series. David Ciccarelli from voices.com. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, guys. Great to be here, and hopefully we can talk again soon.
Great. And Ava Muchler, my colleague, thanks for running the Q&A today and weighing in with your opinions as well.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thanks everyone for joining us today. This will be up on voicebot.ai/webinars as a recording very soon. Thanks.